She froze when she saw me walking into the company couple's dinner. Her eyes froze for a few seconds, and her hand trembled over her wineglass while her boss's arm still rested on her shoulders as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They were at the same table, side by side, like a couple. She tried to hide it, giving me a nervous smile, as if it were possible to fool my eyes, which knew every expression on her face. But her reaction was already an answer. Her silence screamed louder than any justification I could come up with. It wasn't surprise, it was fear. Fear that everything she'd hidden until that moment had finally come to light. Fear that I'd not only discovered the affair, but also that she no longer had control over the narrative. And she didn't. Because in that moment, what hurt me most wasn't the fact that she was with another man, but the cruel realization that she didn't want me to know. She wanted to keep the lie alive longer, to keep smiling at me at home and sharing my bed while she nurtured another world behind my back. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a farce with an indefinite expiration date. And what ate me most was the question that hammered silently inside me: why didn't she just tell me she wanted to break up? After that night, I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't scream. I didn't make a fuss. I simply left the room, my face hot with shame and my heart silently broken. The pain was so intense it robbed me of my hunger, my sleep, my taste for things. I relearned how to breathe on my own, how to move within a house that now felt hollow, where every corner screamed her absence, even when the scent of her perfume still permeated the sheets. Because it's not the end that destroys, it's the emptiness after it. The absence of answers, of dignity, of consideration. How could someone who claimed to love me turn their back without even looking me in the eye? Why had she chosen to lie rather than set me free? For weeks, I wanted to understand. I wanted a conversation, an explanation that would make me at least understand what I had done wrong. But the phone never rang. The door never opened. And deep down, she truly believed she deserved forgiveness simply for not leaving sooner. It was during this period that I realized I was fading away for someone who no longer saw me. And it was there that I decided to move on. Not by force. But by necessity. It was either rebuild myself or wither away until I disappeared completely. I distanced myself, cut ties, reconnected with parts of myself that had been dormant. And then, without waiting for anything, I met another woman. A light yet intense presence. Someone who didn't want to fix me, but who saw me as I was. Someone who, little by little, reminded me what it was like to laugh without guilt, sleep without anguish, love without fear. She was the opposite of everything I had experienced in recent years. And with her, I understood that love shouldn't be a battlefield. It should be a refuge. With her, I learned to no longer blame myself for the end of something that only I was trying to save. But time, that old master, never leaves loose ends for long. And months later, on a random morning, when everything was finally falling into place in my life, she reappeared. My ex-wife, the one who left without looking me in the eye, knocked on my door with tears streaming down her face and her voice choked with despair. "I still love you," she said. As if those words were a magic pass to erase everything. As if the suffering she caused had an expiration date. As if the love that once existed was enough to forgive everything. She said she'd tried to find another man, that she'd had other relationships after the affair with her boss, but none had worked out. She said she finally understood what she'd lost. That now she knew who the man who truly loved her was. She spoke with sincere pain, but a belated pain. A pain that no longer had a place within me. And the strangest thing is, I felt no anger. I looked at her there, in front of me, begging for another chance, and all I could think about was how small she had become in my eyes. She was no longer the woman of my life. And that was her true punishment. Because I didn't have to do anything. Life, with its sense of silent justice, had taken it upon itself to teach me everything I never needed to say. She lost the love of someone who would have loved her forever, simply because she believed she would always have time. She would always have my forgiveness. She would always have my door open. And now that she found it closed, with another woman in my heart, she finally understood that it wasn't just about love. It was about respect. And that, once broken, can't be rebuilt with promises. I still remember the moment she wept silently as she said, "You don't know how much it hurts me to see that you managed to be happy without me." It hit me like a confession she'd kept bottled up for a long time. Because it wasn't regret for what she'd done. It was pain at seeing that I'd moved on. It was envy for a happiness that no longer included her. Because the greatest punishment for those who betray, sometimes, isn't losing the other person. It's seeing them blossom, smile, and love again. And she didn't know it, but that moment, standing in front of my door, wasn't the beginning of a reconciliation. It was the official end of what once existed between us. The most shocking thing is that, since that reunion, she tried everything to get back. She sent letters, flowers, messages, showed up at places I used to frequent. She tried to mend broken bonds. But I couldn't see her the same way anymore. Because betrayal doesn't just kill love. It kills admiration. It kills trust. It kills desire. And when all that dies, what's left is just a familiar face in a strange body. And I refuse to live with a ghost. The worst loneliness is being with someone who no longer reaches you. And at that moment, I was learning to fly, while she was still trying to fix the shards of a mirror she herself broke. Even so, I won't deny it, for a long time, I searched for where I went wrong. I replayed conversations, recalled ordinary days, silent nights, lukewarm Sundays. I tried to understand the exact point where I stopped being enough. Until I understood that I was never the problem. I was the stable, reliable, present love. But for those thirsting for novelty, serene love seems lukewarm. And she confused loyalty with boredom, stability with routine. And in the end, she discovered that the piece she threw away was exactly what was missing in subsequent loves. But now it was too late. Because those who are betrayed learn to protect themselves again. They learn to build walls. And even if forgiveness comes, and it will, one day, the space is already filled. The scar may no longer hurt, but it's still visible. And every time I look at it, I remember that I was able to move on. That I survived the greatest pain without wishing harm. That I started over with dignity, and that, in itself, is victory. But there's something I've never fully understood: what made her so sure I'd wait for her? What made her bet so high on a lie and so low on the love I offered? Maybe she'll never know. Or maybe, today, sitting alone in some room, staring at a silent cell phone, she's finally discovering the answer. And that's why, to this day, I wonder, if I had forgiven her, would she have loved me differently, or would she have just returned to the comfort of stability she scorned? Perhaps the answer lies hidden in the pain she carries to this day. A silent, solitary, irreversible pain. Because she didn't lose a man. She lost the only version of me who loved her unconditionally. And the strangest thing of all, is that the day she returned to my door asking for another chance, a letter arrived in my hands. Written by someone she herself had heard in the past. A woman who, now, crossed my path in an unexpected way. And maybe this letter will change everything. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and will never support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but the feelings, consequences and lessons are deeply real. Our purpose is clear: to show how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and marks the soul of those who truly love. Now take a deep breath, because what comes next is a shocking story, which will stir your emotions from beginning to end. Get ready. Daniel and Laura met on an ordinary September afternoon, as if fate had decided to bring their paths together almost silently, without fanfare, without grandeur. It was during a corporate event, one of those obligatory ones that no one normally wants to attend, but where, for some reason, everything began to change. He was a project manager at a multinational technology company, methodical, observant, with an almost inflexible sense of ethics and a calm that felt like a shield. She, an internal communications analyst, carried with her a light yet magnetic energy, a woman who seemed to effortlessly transition between charm and mystery, capable of dominating a room with a simple smile. Their conversation that afternoon wasn't long or intense, but it was enough to leave a mark. There was a connection, one of those rare connections that doesn't need to be explained in words. It was the beginning of something that, at the time, seemed harmless, but that over time would transform into one of the most profound, and painful, stories of their lives. Their relationship began with small meetings, coffee in the middle of the workday, texting late into the night, and an increasing frequency of glances that said more than any conversation. Before they knew it, they were already immersed in a serious relationship, with plans, trips, and the pleasant illusion that they were building something solid. Soon they were sharing a spacious apartment in a quiet neighborhood, with large windows, hand-picked furniture, and a kitchen that seemed tailor-made for the lazy Sundays they so adored. It was home in every sense. Daniel, with his discreet way, always showed love in the details. He fixed the little things around the house before they became a nuisance, remembered important dates without needing reminders, made a point of making breakfast when she was tired. Laura, on the other hand, brought a contagious vivacity to the relationship. She painted the walls with fresh ideas, decorated the rooms with small personal touches, and had the ability to transform even silence into something comfortable. They built an almost choreographed daily routine, full of silent rituals. Unhurried dinners with candles lit even without a special occasion, series watched hand in hand, long conversations on the balcony about seemingly trivial things that created an intimacy that's hard to explain. Their apartment wasn't just a physical space, it was a reflection of the story they were living. And perhaps that's why, when some noise began to infiltrate, it was hard to notice. It seemed impossible that anything could fall apart there. Their closest friends envied the complicity between the two. Whenever they went out in a group, they were that couple who inspired confidence, who elicited comments like, "Those two were made for each other." Daniel was admired by all for his serenity and poise. Laura was that presence everyone wanted around, always smiling, always willing to help, always willing to listen. Together, they formed a duo that seemed invincible to those observing from the outside. But, like any relationship, theirs also went through adjustments, changes in pace and expectations. Laura began to become more deeply involved in her work. Her company was expanding, and she, ambitious and talented, didn't want to be left behind. She began taking courses, volunteering for new projects, and accepting invitations to events and strategic dinners. Daniel, while proud of his partner's achievements, sometimes felt like a secondary character, a constant presence but no longer essential. He remained the same, dedicated, caring, but there was something in his eyes that was slowly beginning to fade. Still, he didn't complain. He knew that long-term relationships require patience, adaptation, and generosity. And he was willing to wait for that phase of professional intensity to pass. Laura, for her part, felt the need to prove herself. She wanted recognition, she wanted to feel in control of her life, and, without realizing it, she began using work as an outlet for something she couldn't even name. Small, almost imperceptible separations emerged between them. Long conversations began to shorten, nights watching TV became rarer, kisses became hurried. They weren't fights, they were silent absences. Things so small they seemed unworthy of attention. And perhaps that's why they accumulated. Still, there was affection. There was a history. There were memories that insisted on keeping them connected. Laura still made him coffee on Saturdays, Daniel still wrote little notes when he left early. But there was a difference. A kind of shadow in their eyes. A sense that something was changing, though neither had the courage to name it. The pressure began to creep in subtly. Daniel, in a low voice, would ask if she'd be home for dinner, and she'd respond with an, "I don't know," that already sounded automatic. He tried to plan short trips to rekindle their connection, but Laura always had an appointment, a deadline, an unavoidable meeting. Little by little, the "we" gave way to the "I." And yet, the two remained there, sharing the same roof, sleeping side by side, keeping alive a structure that no longer harbored the same essence. It was as if they were trying to save a plant that had stopped blooming, watering the wilted leaves in the hope that a new season would bring back the green. Family members, always attentive, began to notice the signs. During lunch, Daniel's mother discreetly asked if everything was okay between them. He smiled and said yes, that it was just a phase. Laura, when asked by friends about her relationship, responded enthusiastically, but her eyes didn't match her tone. They both knew something had changed, but neither wanted to be the first to admit it. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of pride, or perhaps out of pure attachment to the history they had built with so much love. After all, it's hard to let go of something that was once so beautiful. It's painful to admit that the love that seemed eternal is now made of habits and memories. Even so, Daniel continued to invest in the relationship. He tried to bring her closer, reinvent the moments. He invited Laura on outings, prepared simple surprises. And some days, she seemed to respond. On others, she distanced herself further. Laura was experiencing an internal conflict she couldn't explain. Something between admiration for the partner who had always been by her side and an uncontrollable desire to discover what else existed beyond that stable life. She didn't want to hurt him. But she also didn't want to give up the freedom she felt immersed in the world outside her home. It was as if there were two versions of herself, both fighting for space. Meanwhile, Daniel watched. He felt. He sensed something was being lost, but he clung with all his might to the memories, as if they were capable of holding together the walls that were beginning to crack. They still laughed together sometimes. They still resonated with old memories, old photos, places where they'd shared special moments. But the spark was gone. There was no longer the urgency to be close. Hands touched less frequently. Hugs lasted less. Words of love were replaced by practical, everyday phrases. Romance gave way to companionship. And the silence, once comfortable, now carried a weight difficult to ignore. It was a relationship that still held firm, but no longer moved. A relationship that existed more for history than for the present. Still, everything seemed under control. There were no confrontations, no exposed betrayals, no scandals. There were just two people trying, each in their own way, to sustain a story that seemed to have become bigger than them. And it was in this scenario that life, silent and unpredictable, began to prepare the turning point that would change everything. A turning point neither of them could have foreseen. And one that, when it arrived, would leave no stone unturned. But at that moment, everything still seemed calm. A long, layered relationship, built on love, but threatened by unspoken absences, frustrated expectations, and silences that accumulated like dust on what was once passion. And while Laura lost herself in the growing demands of work and Daniel struggled to rekindle what was still left, time, relentless, just marched on. Waiting for the right moment to show that some cracks, when ignored for too long, eventually become abysses. And that there are wounds that, once opened, never heal the same way. The days began to weigh down like a thick curtain dragging into the mornings, and every gesture between Daniel and Laura seemed calculated, as if they were both measuring the impact of each word before it left their mouths. There was no longer any spontaneity, and even the remaining moments of affection appeared as timid attempts to maintain a structure about to give way. Laura, increasingly involved with company commitments, began to have a routine that extended beyond work hours. Dinners became solitary gatherings for Daniel, who ate silently staring at his cell phone, always with a vague hope that she would call, say she was coming home early, or that she missed him. But the screen remained dark. And when the doorbell rang late at night, there was no longer joy in her arrival, but a kind of bitter relief, as if he were getting used to the idea of being alone even when she still slept beside him. Daniel wasn't the controlling type. He didn't ask invasive questions or demand satisfaction. He believed that love only made sense if it was grounded in freedom. But even freedom has a fine line, and what had once been trust began to turn into unease. There were glances that darted away, smiles that sounded forced, answers that were too rushed. She avoided his touch when she was most tense, changed the subject when he asked about short trips that came up at the last minute, and began to get distracted even in the most intimate conversations. He understood everything, but didn't want to accept it. He was wrong about his own logic, telling himself it was just a phase, that stress and pressure could drive anyone further apart. Until one day, leaving work early because of a cancelled meeting, he decided to surprise her. He bought her favorite wine, an Argentinian sweet they had tried together on a trip years ago, stopped by the florist, and chose a small but symbolic bouquet with the same flowers from their first date. He wanted to create a moment, rekindle something that was fading amidst the noise of routine. He was hopeful, though something in his stomach felt like lead. Arriving home, he noticed she hadn't returned. He called. No answer. He texted. He saw she'd been seen, but there was no response. He waited. The wine sat on the table, the flowers in a glass of water, making a makeshift vase. Time passed slowly. And when the clock struck almost midnight, she finally arrived. Tired, wearing too much makeup for someone who'd spent the day at the office, and wearing a perfume he didn't recognize. She forced a smile, said she was exhausted and just wanted a shower and bed. He didn't notice the wine. Or the flowers. He didn't notice Daniel's eyes searching for any sign of connection. And he didn't ask anything. He just watched her disappear down the hallway. It was that night that he began to crumble inside. He spent hours awake, lying beside her, listening to her steady breathing while his mind spun in circles. Images, possibilities, words spoken and unspoken jumbled together in his head like a movie with scenes out of order. The next morning, he left for work quietly. He didn't leave a note. He didn't make coffee. Something inside him had begun to change. It wasn't anger. It was the silent pain of someone beginning to understand that love is slipping through their fingers and there's no stopping it. The following days were lived with surgical attention. He noticed everything. The elaborate clothes. The evasive answers. The laughter typed on her phone that she hid when she noticed he was nearby. The gleam in her eyes that was no longer meant for him. But even with all this, Daniel still clung to hope. Until the invitation arrived, a couple's dinner at her company. A formal, elegant event, surrounded by colleagues, bosses, and companions. She invited him reluctantly, as if she had to follow protocol. She told him he didn't have to go, that she would be surrounded by work people, that he might get bored. But he insisted. He said he wanted to support her, that it had been a while since they'd been out together, that it would be good to be there as a couple. She hesitated, smiled calculatedly, and agreed. On the day of the dinner, Daniel arrived punctually at the hotel ballroom where the event would take place. He looked elegant, but with a visible discomfort in his shoulders. He searched for her among the tables, smiling politely at strangers, observing the room with restrained attention. And then he saw her. Laura was sitting at the main table with other co-workers. Beside her was the company director, a man of striking presence, charming, and experienced. But what really caught his attention was the way he rested his hand on her waist, the knowing smile, the intimate tone of their conversation. And the look in her eyes when she saw him arrive. A start. A sudden nervousness. As if she hadn't expected him to actually come. As if she'd forgotten there was still a bond, a ring on her hand, a living story. He approached slowly. Each step was a confirmation. Every glance they exchanged at the table felt like a blade. She stood, hurriedly straightened her dress, and attempted an explanation. But Daniel merely greeted everyone present with a cold smile, sat in the chair he was shown, and pretended to participate in the conversation. The food lost its flavor. The air grew thin. And there he was, experiencing in slow motion what would be the collapse of what had once been his home. Dinner lasted a little over an hour, but it felt like an eternity. When it was over, he politely said goodbye and left before her. He said nothing. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. But inside, his entire world had collapsed. Back home, he sat in the living room in silence. The old bouquet, now dry, still sat in its glass. The wine, already expired, remained unopened. The memories suffocated him. And the questions returned with more force. When exactly had she stopped loving him? At what point had he stopped being enough? And why, among so many choices, had she chosen to lie? Deep down, he already knew. But knowing didn't make it any easier to bear. The next day, Laura returned home with a speech prepared, as if the previous night had been merely a misunderstanding. She talked about how she was being pressured at work, how her boss was just a friend who admired her professionally, how she loved him and that he was overreacting. But her words fell to the floor like broken glass. Daniel heard, but no longer felt. She touched his arm, but the warmth didn't reach his skin. The distance had become concrete. Irreversible. He began to avoid long conversations. He left the house early and returned late. He started running on weekends, something he'd never done before. He talked less. He observed more. And one day, arriving home unexpectedly, he saw what he already knew but hadn't yet witnessed. Her boss's car in the garage, the living room window with the curtains half open, and 2 glasses of wine still half empty on the table. She didn't see him. He didn't come in. He simply walked away silently, like someone who closes a book before the end because they already know the outcome. That night, she slept in a cheap hotel. The next day, she packed a few clothes in a small suitcase and left without leaving a note. It wasn't an escape. It was survival. Laura called repeatedly. She sent messages. She tried to contact mutual friends. But Daniel was unreachable. Because what she destroyed wasn't just a relationship. It was the silent trust that held everything together. It was the image of an us that seemed unbreakable. And now, all that remained was a void, and questions that would never be answered. But there was something she didn't know. Something he discovered that very week. A missing piece of the puzzle. A piece of information that would silently change everything. The secret she never imagined would come to light. And that, when revealed, would show that the betrayal was only the surface of a much deeper abyss. Life had moved on, albeit silently, albeit with scars Daniel preferred not to touch. Ever since he left that house, he decided not to look back. Not out of cowardice, but because he knew that certain pains, when revisited, become poison. It was better to leave them deep within, among the parts of the soul we learn to ignore. He continued living alone for a while, rediscovering his own rhythm, filling the empty spaces with new habits, new books, new people. Until he met Sophia. She arrived unannounced, in the most unexpected way, in a bakery line on a random Saturday, and from her first smile, she brought a kind of lightness he had forgotten existed. She wasn't overwhelming, she was calm. She didn't promise great revolutions, but she conveyed security, presence, truth. With her, Daniel didn't feel he needed to prove himself. He simply was. And that, after everything he had been through, was liberating. Sophia listened attentively, but never forced him to talk about the past. She didn't need explanations to know the scars were there. She knew how to respect silences and, little by little, gain space, not through urgency, but through constancy. When he finally felt comfortable talking about what he'd experienced, she listened with a calm gaze and simply told him he deserved better. She didn't call Laura a villain, nor that he was stupid for trusting too much. She simply reaffirmed that he had the right to feel betrayed, hurt, and also the right to start over. It was then that Daniel understood that true love doesn't judge another's pain. It embraces it. While he was rebuilding his life, Laura was going through another process. Her relationship with the company director fell apart months later. What had seemed intense and passionate soon revealed its fragility. There was no partnership, no foundation, only momentary desire and convenience. When she finally realized she was alone, it wasn't the end of the relationship that affected her most, but the void left by Daniel's absence. A void that no professional achievement could fill. And the more she tried to move on, the more she found herself surrounded by superficial relationships, empty conversations, and long nights with no one by her side. The glow she thought she had achieved faded with each day she didn't have someone to share her small victories and daily failures with. His absence was like an open wound that wouldn't heal, no matter how much time passed. That's why, on a cloudy March afternoon, she decided to look for him. She drove to his old address, waited outside, sitting in her car, rehearsing what she would say 1,000 times. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to tell him she still loved him. She wanted to know if there was still a chance. When she saw him leaving the building, laughing alongside a strange woman, her stomach dropped. The way he looked at her, the way he held her hand naturally, the way he spoke and laughed, everything was different. Daniel was no longer the man she'd left behind. He had changed. He had blossomed. And she, standing there, felt invisible. However, she didn't give up. She waited a few days, thought, wrote a letter, and erased it. And then she decided to go to him. When she showed up at his door, she was visibly shaken, her eyes sunken, her subtle makeup unable to hide her emotional exhaustion. Daniel was surprised to see her, but he showed neither anger nor pain. Only a sharp neutrality, as if she were no longer part of his world. She asked to come in, and he, out of respect for the past, allowed her. They sat in the living room, and the silence between them felt like a minefield. She began by saying she didn't expect forgiveness, but she needed to speak, needed to say that everything she'd experienced after him had been empty, that nothing compared to the stability, security, and love he gave. She said she was sorry, that she knew she'd hurt him, but that she still loved him, and that she wanted to try to rebuild, even if it had to be from scratch. Daniel listened, impassive. And then she said what he hadn't expected. That there was something she'd never told him. Something she needed to reveal. He looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. He asked why now, why only after everything. She hesitated, but then stood up, paced, took a deep breath, and said the betrayal wasn't just an emotional decision. She said that, weeks before she started dating the director, she had a conversation with her older sister. A conversation in which she confessed that she felt she was wasting her youth on a man who was too predictable. Her sister, who had always been more cynical about relationships, said something that stuck with her: "You love Daniel like you love a house. But maybe it's time to experience what it's like to live on a roller coaster." That shook Laura. She began to convince herself that stability was synonymous with stagnation. She began to see his dedication as weakness, not love. And then she made a decision that, to this day, haunts her. She began to lie to herself. It wasn't out of love for the other person, nor passion. It was ego. She wanted to prove she could, that she still aroused desire, that she was desired, admired, sought after. She wanted to feel what she thought she had lost. And so, the week before the company dinner, she had done something even crueler than physical betrayal. She asked her sister to help her fake a situation that would make her look like a victim. Daniel didn't understand. She continued. She explained that, influenced by her sister and a mutual friend, she and the director had planned a fake professional leave of absence to justify her absences. She fabricated pressure from management, simulated veiled threats of dismissal, all to paint Daniel as a woman who had been wronged, overworked, and misunderstood. And when he showed concern, she would have the perfect scenario, the ideal excuse to step away for a while, to breathe, to figure out what she wanted. But everything spiraled out of control. Her involvement with the director stopped being a ruse and became real. The lies grew. And before she knew it, she had already severed all ties with the world she'd built with Daniel. The most devastating thing wasn't that she'd cheated. It was that she'd deliberately manipulated her own image to justify something she'd brought upon herself. Daniel listened silently, his eyes fixed, as if each word were a slow knife. When she finished, she burst into tears. She said she couldn't live with it anymore, that she needed to clear her conscience, that she hoped he could see she was still the same person she'd been before, just lost. He stood up slowly, looked around his own room, and said something she would never forget: "You didn't just destroy what we had. You destroyed the image I had of you. What you did wasn't just about us. It was about who you are when no one's looking." She tried to get closer, but he backed away. He said he didn't hate her, but that he couldn't feel anything anymore. That he had, indeed, overcome it, but at the cost of burying a part of him that would never return. And that now, everything she said would only be an echo of a truth he had already left behind. She left in tears, and he remained standing there, staring at the closed door. Not out of bitterness, but out of relief. Because in that moment, he understood he needed nothing more to move on. The truth had arrived. And with it, freedom. But what he didn't yet know, what no one imagined, was that this story still held one final twist. And this time, it wasn't about Laura. It was about him. And about something that was about to happen. Something that would completely change the outcome of this story. After Laura left that night, Daniel didn't turn off the living room light. He stood there, his eyes fixed on the closed door, feeling her presence dissolve in the air like a perfume that insists on lingering for a few moments, even after being swept away by the wind. There was no hatred in his chest, nor any resentment. There was only a dense stillness, an absolute silence that, instead of regret, brought a strange peace. It was as if that confession, so painful, so calculatedly cruel, had erased the last vestiges of doubt he still harbored. Laura hadn't just broken promises. She had engineered an entire distortion of reality to justify a selfish desire. And this, more than the betrayal itself, showed that she never understood the depths of who he was, of what being by his side meant. The next morning, Daniel woke before the sun, opened the apartment windows, and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he felt light. He made a strong coffee, the kind that warms you from within, and called Sophia. Her voice, even still sleepy, sounded like a shelter. He didn't elaborate. He simply said he needed to see her, and she, without question, replied that she would be at his house in half an hour. When he arrived, he welcomed her with a long, silent hug. He simply closed his eyes and allowed himself to be there, whole, surrendered. They sat on the balcony, where the day was beginning to tint the sky with soft shades of orange and blue, and Daniel told her everything. Every word. Every detail. Without omitting anything. Sophia listened to him silently, her gaze steady, without interrupting. When he finished, she came closer, held his hands firmly, and said in a voice both sweet and strong that he no longer had to carry any of this alone. That she didn't see him as a broken man, but as someone who had survived what few would be able to endure. And that her love for him didn't depend on the past, but on the man he had become because of, and despite, it all. The days that followed were marked by an intense reconnection between Daniel and Sophia. It wasn't a romance full of grand gestures, but there was depth in every small gesture, in every shared glance, in every respected silence. It was as if each of them was healing the other, little by little, with patience and truth. Sophia began visiting Daniel's apartment more often, and soon they were sharing not only spaces, but also plans. There was no rush. There was desire. There was presence. On the other side, Laura was plunged into a slow and painful process of loss. Not only of Daniel, but of herself. She realized she no longer knew who she was when she wasn't desired, admired, or noticed. For the first time, she confronted the true image of who she had become. Friends gradually drifted away, the work environment became hostile, and even her sister, complicit in her most destructive decisions, began to treat her with distance, as if no longer wanting to be involved in her dramas. The world seemed to have shrunk, and the echo of loneliness became deafening. She tried to pick herself up, sought out therapists, immersed herself in self-discovery books, and tried to reconnect with old connections. But with each attempt, she found closed doors that she herself had locked long ago. One afternoon, leaving an appointment, she was walking distractedly down the sidewalk when she saw Daniel and Sophia walking into a cafe together. He was laughing at something Sophia was saying, with a wide, carefree smile. It was a smile she knew but hadn't seen in years. A smile of someone who was whole. And it was at that moment that everything collapsed inside her, definitively. She felt her legs weaken, her eyes sting, and she retreated before they could see her. She ran home, locked herself in her room, and cried until she couldn't cry anymore. It wasn't just longing anymore. It was the recognition that, even if she could go back in time, she wouldn't know how to do it differently. And that was even more devastating than regret. In the following weeks, Laura decided to write a letter. Not with the intention of winning Daniel back, but with the urgent need to say something she had never been able to put into words. She spoke of her childhood, her insecurities, the fears she had always masked with arrogance, her rash choices, her sleepless nights, the weight of being someone who didn't know how to love properly. She confessed that she had always seen in Daniel a kind of kindness she didn't understand, and perhaps that was why she had tried to destroy him, because his light exposed her. She ended the letter by saying that she hoped he would be happy, truly happy, and that she had finally understood that loving someone isn't about wanting to be with them at any cost, but about longing for their peace, even if it happens far from us. Daniel read the letter days after receiving it. He felt something strange. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was a kind of mature, pure compassion. He understood that Laura was finally paying the price for her choices, not with external punishments, but with the most merciless thing, regret. But he didn't respond. He felt that any response would be an invitation to the past, and he was already on the other side of that bridge. The following month, Sophia organized a short weekend getaway for the two of them. They chose a rustic house on the outskirts of a town with a mild climate, surrounded by trees, trails, and a stream. It was a secluded, quiet place, where time seemed to flow differently. On the first night, sitting by the fireplace, she looked Daniel in the eye and told him there was something he still needed to do. That to truly move on, he needed to free himself from the pain he still carried in his eyes when he spoke of everything he'd experienced. He tried to argue, saying he'd moved on, that he held no grudges. But she insisted, lovingly, that forgiveness isn't just about the other person, it's about letting go of what anchors us to the past. Daniel spent the night thinking about her words. The next day, he woke before sunrise, walked along the stone path, and sat by the stream. He remained there in silence, listening to the water flow. He took a pen and paper and wrote his last letter to Laura. Not with accusations, but with gratitude. He thanked her for the good times, the happy memories, the lessons learned. He said he wouldn't forget her, but he would stop carrying her inside his heart. And now, finally, he was ready to live in the present. He folded the paper, placed it in an empty bottle, and threw it into the river. He watched as she was carried away by the current, until she disappeared. Upon returning to the city, news spread among old acquaintances. Laura had quit her job, sold her apartment, and moved to another country. She wanted to start over. Alone. Far from everything that reminded her of what she'd lost. He left without goodbyes, without fanfare. He simply left, as if he understood, too late, that some losses are permanent. And that sometimes, the greatest punishment for betrayal is not the abandonment of the other, but the abandonment of oneself. Daniel and Sophia, on the other hand, continued to build their story with patience and truth. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And he, now whole, could love without fear, without ghosts, without guilt. Because he understood that pain is inevitable, but remaining in it is a choice. And he had chosen to move on. With a clean heart. With a light soul. With his eyes focused on the future. And the past? It finally rested. In peace. Daniel and Sophia's return to the city was silent, like everything carried with the serenity of someone who left something behind and no longer intends to retrieve it. Time between them began to flow with a fluidity that seemed almost intuitive, without pressure, without urgency, just a tacit agreement of mutual presence. The routine he once knew as a tightening rope now presented itself as a gentle dance between work, shared morning coffees, bedtime conversations, and comfortable silences that required no explanation. Their relationship wasn't made of grandiose promises, but of simple truths. And perhaps that's why it was so strong. There were still, of course, traces of old pain, some insecurities that surfaced at the most unexpected moments, but there was also a genuine desire to rebuild, to not repeat patterns, to not carry into the present what belonged to the past. However, even when we think we've closed all chapters, life has ways of testing the solidity of the choices we've made. A few weeks after the trip, Daniel received an unexpected email. It was from Laura's father. The tone was direct but polite. It asked for a brief conversation, in person, if possible. It said it wasn't about reconciliation or attempts to mend broken ties, but about something that needed to be clarified. For a moment, Daniel considered ignoring it, but there was something in that message that didn't sound like interference or drama, but rather like a pending settlement. After a few days of reflection, he responded and scheduled a meeting for a Saturday morning at a discreet cafe in the city. Upon arrival, she found the man older than she remembered, with deep dark circles under her eyes and a heavy expression. They exchanged restrained greetings and sat down. Laura's father began by thanking her for helping him and, bluntly, said that his daughter was living in another country, trying to reorganize her life, but that she had left something behind that needed to be discussed. He explained that, shortly before leaving, Laura had gone through a series of intense emotional crises, and in one of her sessions with her therapist, she revealed something she had never mentioned to anyone. Daniel frowned, feeling a weight on his chest. Her father hesitated, but then confessed that, during the period when Laura began to get involved with the company director, she had also begun to entertain the idea of sabotaging, albeit unconsciously, not only the relationship but also Daniel's image in the eyes of others close to her. It hit him like a cold blast. His father explained that Laura, overcome by guilt and inner turmoil, tried to deflect the pain of her choices by creating small rumors, veiled insinuations about Daniel's supposed emotional distance, a lack of interest in their private life, even suggesting to some friends that he might be having an affair outside of their relationship. Nothing explicit, nothing substantiated, but enough to quietly undermine his reputation in the circle that once admired them as a couple. It was an unconscious way, according to the therapist, of trying to justify her actions, of not carrying the burden of betrayal alone. It was another layer of the silent manipulation she engineered without fully understanding its true impact. Daniel listened in silence, his fingers trembling over his coffee cup, his breath shallow. He felt invaded again, as if someone had tampered with a locked cupboard. It wasn't just the physical betrayal, it wasn't just the emotional lie. Now there was also his image, distorted, used as a bargaining chip in the midst of a crisis that wasn't his. Laura's father looked embarrassed, his eyes welling up. He said he was only there because he thought it was fair, that he needed to know, that his daughter was trying to change, but that the truth, however painful, should be known. Daniel thanked him with a discreet nod, finished his coffee, and stood up. There was nothing more to say. In the following days, he walked with that revelation as if carrying an invisible weight. He tried not to think about it, tried to focus on work, on moments with Sophia, on the small everyday joys. But somewhere in his mind, the wound was beginning to reopen. Not from the pain of being misunderstood, but from the abuse of trust, the silent disrespect. He decided not to tell Sophia anything immediately. Not out of fear or shame, but because he knew he needed to process it first, to understand what it still meant to him. It was one night, while they were walking through a park at dusk, that he decided to speak. He told her everything calmly, choosing his words carefully, observing her reactions to each new sentence. Sophia listened attentively, and when he finished, she hugged him tightly. She said she wasn't surprised, because she'd always known that lost people try to drag others into the same abyss, but that she admired the strength with which he was dealing with everything. And once again, Daniel felt that rare kind of love, the one that doesn't judge, the one that welcomes, the one that doesn't demand more than you can give. That same night, sitting on the porch, he reflected on everything he had experienced. A profound moral dilemma now loomed large. Forgiving didn't mean forgetting, but neither could it be an eternal burden. Was it possible to move forward knowing he had been unfairly singled out, even if subtly, as the culprit? Was it right to let everyone who had been lied to continue believing them out of convenience? Or would true relief come from simply accepting that there is no control over what others think, and that, in the end, only what matters is what is built from here on out? Daniel didn't find all the answers that night. But he understood that part of emotional maturity is accepting that not all injustices will be redressed, and that sometimes the greatest act of strength is not demanding anything, just following along. Sophia, noticing his silence, simply sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, and they remained like that for long minutes, without needing to say anything else. At work, Daniel began to be invited more frequently to lectures and workshops. His name, once quietly tarnished by malicious comments, was now synonymous with integrity, competence, and leadership. He didn't seek public rehabilitation, but the truth, over time, illuminated what had been obscured. People who had previously distanced themselves from him returned to him, some offering veiled apologies, others simply showing silent respect. And he welcomed them all with dignity, without resentment. Because he no longer needed to prove anything. His life spoke for itself. His relationship with Sophia also evolved. There was no formal proposal, no bending of the knee. One day, on a simple walk, she asked him how he felt about the idea of sharing a home, and he replied that he'd never felt so ready. They rented a house together, small but full of windows and natural light. They planted a few trees in the yard, hung chosen paintings together, and created new routines, unafraid of repeating the past. They were living not a new story on ancient ruins, but something completely different, built from scratch. Still, on certain silent nights, Daniel still thought of Laura. Not with pain, but with a mix of curiosity and compassion. He wondered how she was, what she was doing, if she still carried the ghosts of what she'd done or if she'd learned to live with them. He never wanted to know the details. He never sought news. But there was an invisible thread of humanity that kept him from wishing her harm. He simply hoped she had found some kind of peace. And that, one day, she, too, would understand the value of true love. The past was now a distant shadow, and the present seemed increasingly solid. There were still challenges, arguments, differences of opinion. But above all, there was a conscious decision to stay. To not give up on difficult days. To not abandon in moments of silence. Because, above all, Daniel had understood that love is not just about enchantment, but about choice. Choosing to be there, choosing to care, choosing to start over when necessary. And even without knowing it, Laura was also reaching her own turning point. In another place, among other people, before different mirrors, she finally began to see herself without the mask she'd always worn. For the first time, she wasn't seeking redemption in someone else's eyes, but trying to find it within herself. And it was a painful, lonely, but necessary process. Because only when pain transforms into awareness does true change begin. And sometimes, the greatest punishment of betrayal isn't being abandoned. It's realizing, too late, that the love you destroyed was the last place where truth existed. The new phase of Daniel's life seemed to be on firm, but not always calm, ground. There were no illusions of perfection in his journey with Sophia, and this, paradoxically, was what made their relationship so solid. They learned to deal with moments of disagreement with patience, with the clarity of those unprepared for idealized expectations. There was love, yes, but above all, there was a silent alliance of respect and truth. And even though both still bore old scars, they knew that building a new path required more than forgetting the past, it required relearning how to live without hiding from it. Daniel, now more introspective, spent most of his time focused on his work in small household projects with Sophia. And even with the present peace, there was a growing restlessness within him. Something still unfinished, as if there were a story waiting to be closed with a firm ending. Not out of emotional need, but because he wanted, somehow, to reorganize his own inner narrative. He understood that forgiving and moving on were independent attitudes, but there was a part of the journey that he had not yet faced head-on. That's why, on a cloudy weekend, during a walk among the trees in a park far from the city, Daniel looked at Sophia and said, almost in a whisper, that he wanted to write a book. At first, she just smiled in surprise. But as he explained that it wasn't just any book, but an intimate account, not about his failed love story, but about rebuilding after the shipwreck, about how self-love overcame pain, about how it's possible to start over without looking for culprits or heroes, she understood that his desire wasn't vanity, it was necessity. He wanted to transform suffering into testimony, and testimony into something that could perhaps, one day, help others. Sophia immediately supported the idea. She said the world needed truths told without embellishments, without facile moralizing. And Daniel began. With pages still uncertain, with broken sentences, but with brutal sincerity. He wrote without disguise, without needing to disguise feelings, and as he wrote, he felt increasingly free. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Laura lived a very different reality. Her attempt at a fresh start had encountered greater obstacles than she imagined. Friendships were fragile, relationships unstable, and even the new career she sought to rebuild was riddled with distrust. After all, rebuilding herself in a new place required more than changing languages or addresses. She had to change from within, and that was the hardest part. She spent days alone in a small apartment, trying to make sense of the decisions she had made. She remembered old conversations with Daniel, the caring gestures, the way he looked at her even when she no longer saw him. And it hurt. It hurt to know she held something rare in her hands, and she allowed her vanity and thirst for novelty to lead her down a path that now seemed irreversible. She began writing letters she would never send, almost as a confession to herself. In them, she asked for forgiveness, not only from him, but from the version of herself that once believed in love and threw it away because she couldn't deal with her own insecurity. One day, while walking the streets of her new city, she accidentally entered a small bookstore and came across a book in the window. The title caught her eye because it had something familiar, an echo of a phrase Daniel had often used when they were still together. As she approached, her stomach lurched. It was his name, printed on the cover. She picked up the book with trembling hands, quickly leafing through the first few pages, and with each word, her breath grew heavier. The descriptions, the feelings, the metaphors, everything was deeply his. And even without naming names, she recognized herself in every paragraph. In every silence. In every mentioned absence. She bought the book and returned home as if carrying a box of mirrors. She spent the night reading, rereading, crying. That story, though written with elegance and generosity, was a portrait of everything she had ignored. There were no accusations, but there was pain. There was no anger, but there was disappointment. And the most painful thing of all was realizing that, even though he was hurt, Daniel had managed to transform the pain into something beautiful. While she was still trying to piece together what was left. The following week, driven by an impulse that mixed remorse with longing, she wrote an email. Not with promises, not with requests for reconciliation. Just a thank you. She said she read every line with a heavy heart, and that for the first time, she understood the true magnitude of what she had caused. She hadn't expected anything, but needed to say she was proud of him, even from afar. Daniel read the message late that afternoon, while drinking coffee on the porch. He didn't respond immediately. He stared at the horizon for a long time, trying to understand what he felt. There was no euphoria, no indignation. There was a sense of a cycle. That, finally, their story had found a kind of silent closure, without an audience, without dramatic reunions. Just a full stop that no longer hurt. In the days that followed, Daniel completed his book. Sophia was the first to read the final version. When she finished, with tears in her eyes, she said she had never been so proud of it. He said the book wasn't just about overcoming, it was about humanity. About failing, falling, being betrayed, getting lost, and still finding your way back. He hugged her tightly and, for the first time, felt like he had truly freed himself. The past was now just context, no longer a burden. A few weeks later, they received an invitation to a literary event, where Daniel would be one of the authors invited to speak about his work. It was an important opportunity, but also a test. It was the first time he would speak publicly about anything. On the day of the event, the auditorium was full. People of all ages, their faces attentive. When he took the stage, he felt his heart race. But when he saw Sophia in the front row, he smiled and began. He spoke sincerely, calmly. He didn't try to dramatize anything. He simply told his story. And when he finished, he received a standing ovation. Not for being a victim, but for having the courage to move forward, to transform pain into growth. On the way out, while taking photos and chatting with some readers, he was approached by a young woman who said, "I've experienced what you experienced. But I could never put it into words. Your book gave me a voice." Daniel smiled and replied, "Then it was worth it." And in that moment, more than any other, he knew there was nothing left to repair. He was whole. Real. Free. And ready for whatever life had in store for him. That rainy night, Daniel arrived home, his eyes still teary from the intensity of the previous days, but his chest light, as if the weight of the world had finally lifted from his shoulders. Sophia was already waiting for him in the living room, sitting on the sofa with a glass of wine in her hands and the serene look of someone who understands without needing to ask. He entered silently, approached, and hugged her firmly, with a caress that said more than any words could convey. The world outside might still be turbulent, full of memories and traces of what was, but there, inside that house, there was peace. They had won, not like someone defeating an enemy, but like someone weathering a storm without losing themselves. The book was officially released days later, to a much greater response than expected. It received rave reviews and emotional messages from readers who saw themselves reflected in the pain and reconstructions narrated. It became, without fanfare, a symbol of emotional resilience. But for Daniel, more than the recognition, it was the feeling of having closed a cycle in the most dignified way possible. In the months that followed, he and Sophia traveled to several countries, experienced light-hearted moments, and rediscovered the joy of the unexpected, the pleasure of small, everyday adventures. Gradually, their plans began to take on more serious forms. They decided to buy a house together, far from the city, in a quieter place, with space to plant, create, and build. Not because they wanted to escape the world, but because they wanted to shape the world their way. It was the beginning of a new phase, and this time, without any lurking ghosts. Across the ocean, Laura's life was taking a very different path. Reading Daniel's book had an impact on her that no one could have predicted. For days, she isolated herself. She avoided contact, ignored invitations, and even turned down important jobs. It wasn't ordinary sadness, it was confrontation. Each line of the work was a mirror reflecting not only the woman she had been, but the woman she had stopped being. For the first time, she looked back without excuses, without distortions. She saw how lost she had become in her own empty ambitions, how much she had hurt someone who only wanted to truly love her, how much she had destroyed something rare by failing to appreciate the simplicity of a true life. And it was at that moment that she decided to change not just her country, but her very essence. She enrolled in a humanitarian aid program in the Latin American countryside. It wasn't an escape, it was an attempt at reconnection. She wanted to do something that didn't involve her image, her career, or her vanity. Something that wouldn't attract applause, only purpose. She began living in small communities, helping out at local schools, organizing educational programs, translating books, and caring for children. At first, they thought she wouldn't resist the simplicity of that lifestyle, but Laura stayed. She found a kind of quiet redemption there. No one knew her, no one judged her. For the first time, she was free of the need for approval, the anxiety for status, and began to experience a peace she had never known. She still thought about Daniel, yes, but not with the anguish of someone trying to win someone back, but with the gratitude of someone who recognizes they were loved by someone who deserved the best. She knew she would never get a second chance. And over time, she understood she no longer needed it. Years later, on a warm summer evening, Daniel walked through the trees on the property he now shared with Sophia. The gardens were blooming, the trees were growing strong, and a small hammock swayed beneath a wooden structure he had built himself. On the porch, Sophia read silently as the sky changed colors, from blue to deep orange. As he approached, he stopped for a moment and observed the woman he had chosen to share his life with, her serene gaze, her calm demeanor, her constant presence. He sat beside her, touched her hand, and said that if he could go back in time, he would go through it all again, just to be sure she would be there, in that very moment. She smiled, her eyes full of meaning, and replied that love, when it's true, never arrives late. It arrives when we are ready to receive it. Daniel's book began to be studied at some universities as an example of emotionally honest autobiographical narrative. He received invitations for new projects, but he turned most of them down. He preferred to live in peace, with the essentials, out of the spotlight. He knew he had said everything he needed to say. Now, the rest of his life was about living, not telling. One day, he received a letter from an unknown man, who claimed to have been Laura's last partner. In the letter, the man recounted that she had spoken of him with inexplicable affection, and that even though she had never met him again, she had made it clear that Daniel was the greatest love of her life, even if misunderstood, even if wasted. The letter ended with a silent thank you for loving her. Even if it took her a while to understand. Daniel folded the letter, put it in a drawer, and never opened it again. Because he understood, with the maturity of those who have survived the abyss, that some stories don't need continuations. They just need to be remembered as they were, intense, painful, and necessary. Meanwhile, Laura continued her journey, far from everything that once defined her. She became an important figure in the community where she lived. She wasn't recognized for her beauty, but for her dedication. She wasn't celebrated for her achievements, but for her presence. Little by little, she earned respect and, more importantly, found peace. Not the artificial peace of a life without challenges, but the peace of someone who looks back and knows that, despite all her mistakes, she decided to do things differently. She never forgot Daniel. She carried his memory like a book read only once, but which resonates throughout her life. A lost love that, instead of being buried, was transformed into a learning experience. And that, for her, was the greatest redemption she could achieve. Sophia, in turn, remained by Daniel's side with the same determination that had won her heart. She never competed with the past. She understood that mature love doesn't require erasing what came before, but knowing how to live with the other person's story without diminishing oneself. She was the now. She was home. And together, they built a new narrative, where old pains existed, yes, but no longer dictated the next chapters. They lived fully, with conscious choices, with mutual respect. The past became memory. And memory became a lesson. And this lesson, perhaps, is the most important of all. When true love is destroyed, you don't just lose a relationship. You lose the chance to be better with someone who believed in you. Betrayal isn't just about desire, it's about selfishness. It's about breaking something that can often never be rebuilt. Time passes, life goes on, but there are scars that stay with us forever. And no matter how much forgiveness exists, some people simply don't come back. Because when trust is lost, the foundation is lost. And without a foundation, nothing stands. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced something similar or know someone who has? Comment below. I read everything. Also, subscribe to the channel, because every week we have real, moving, and profound stories like this one, which show the complexity of human relationships and the impact of our choices. And here's the thought: betrayal destroys more than just a relationship. It breaks up families, ruins dreams, strips away the dignity of those betrayed, and slowly erodes even the betrayer. The pain can be overcome, but the consequences, these can last forever. Remembering, this channel does not support, encourage or romanticize any type of betrayal. Until the next story. Get ready. Because what's coming will move you.